The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. Consider for a moment the voices you hear in the course of a day. For better or worse, most of us don't lack for voices in our lives, though we might lack for healthy ones. From the moment we wake up until the moment we go to bed, in some ways, that's all we hear. Voices. If we're lucky, they're from people in person with whom we share our lives together. These are the voices of our home, our work, our classroom, our daily routines. Other voices, especially in this pandemic moment, come to us mainly by the phone or computer or some other means of communication. Still, there are those voices that are only one way, that come to us from the television or the radio or that voice-enabled device looking at you, Alexa. And still, there are those voices that transcend time. Maybe you have a few of those, the voices of your parents, your grandparents, your spouse, your friend. Those voices that may not be present in the day, but are there somewhere. And that, of course, doesn't get at the most inescapable voice in our lives, our own. Not just the one that comes out of our mouths, but the one that lodges somewhere between our ears. You know the one, don't you? The one that whispers to us throughout our day, the one that, by the grace of God, no one else can hear. Because let's be honest, friends, that one, the one that resides in our head, is not always pretty. No, I would imagine if each of us were given the choice between walking around naked for the day or having a speaker announce every thought that came through our head, we would have a lot of charges for indecent exposure. It's not always pretty in there, not for public disclosure. Sure, at its best, that inner voice is there to help us, to keep us alive, to keep us from heading down the wrong path. Do you really need another cookie, Stephen? But it's not always at its best, is it? As some of us know all too well, sometimes that inner voice just won't stop. We can't just turn it off. When it just keeps replaying that conversation or rehashing that fear or going over that worry again and again and again, maybe some of us are there this morning. And unlike the other voices in our lives, that one we can't just turn off. We can't just tune it out. No, we try, sure. There are some in healthier ways than others to tune it out. But at some point, each of us has to learn to live with that voice, to figure out when to give it power and when to let it go. The question is, how? In some ways, that's the question for all of the voices in our lives, both inner and outer. They are related, of course. We know that, don't we? As some of us know from hard experience, if we find ourselves in a low place, it can be hard to hear any of those voices of hope out there. And at the same time, if all we're feeding ourselves, if all we're listening to are those voices of negativity, is it really any wonder that our thoughts follow? Friends, what are the voices you hear, you listen to in the course of a day? Are they life-giving? Seems a particularly important question right now, doesn't it? Part of the place we find ourselves in this moment of division is because we are only listening to specific voices, to separate voices. Each of us is choosing which voices we want to listen to. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. As we've grown further apart from one another, it's become harder to hear different voices. We've limited the voices that we hear, not quantity, of course. There are many voices out there, but certainly quality, and if not quality, then at least variety. It's become so easy to just walk into that echo chamber of life and only hear those voices that already agree with us, that tell us the things that we already believe. And as we know, the longer we spend in that echo chamber, the easier it is to forget that there are other voices out there. And the sooner we forget those other voices, the sooner we forget the persons, the people behind them. Is it any wonder that into that void has stepped misinformation and distrust and conspiracy? The thing about a conspiracy theory is that it's so hard to disprove, because the moment you try, the harder you try, the more it seems like you're a part of the conspiracy. Maybe we know the one about the two conspiracy theorists who died and go to heaven, and they stand before God, who agrees to answer any question that they might have. Who killed JFK, they ask. Lee Harvey Oswald, God said. And the conspiracy theorists look at each other and say, this goes a lot higher than we thought. It's funny until it's not. It's harmless until it's not. Until conspiracy theory and disinformation and mistrust leads rioters to a deadly Capitol outing. Until it poisons the minds of our young people with racist notions, until it distorts the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, into an excuse for violence. No, friends, at some point, each of us has to decide which voices in our lives we will give power. And it can't just be the ones that already agree with us, because as we each know, still somewhere deep down, even if we don't admit it, that is not where the truth lies. And just in case we've forgotten, as a people of faith, the truth still matters to us. We remember that, don't we? I am the way and the truth and the life. If we want the voice of God to be one of those voices we hear in our lives, if we want an alternative to the din that is out there, to the anxiety and the worry and the fear of the moment, then we're going to have to listen to the truth. Because, friends, where there is truth, there is God. Wherever we find it, God is already there. As the man whose birthday we stopped to celebrate this weekend reminded us, a lie cannot live. The truth is, friends, neither can we within it. As a people of faith, we have to listen for the voice of truth. And the good news of the gospel is that we don't have to do it alone. And it often takes someone else to find it. Our scripture lesson today is the story of a boy who hears the voice of God, but isn't so sure whether he can trust it. Maybe there's something in it for us. Now, some, especially those who completed the Bicentennial Bible Challenge, will remember that Samuel was the firstborn son of Hannah, nice name, who promised that if she were to have this son, she would allow him to be a Nazirite, that is, a special order of the priestly class. We know, of course, that Samuel goes on to become the one who would anoint the first kings of Israel, but here he has yet to hear the voice of God in his life. He is only a boy. He is an apprentice under Eli who is growing older and waiting to pass along the knowledge that he has. But when we join them today, they are both taking naps. Not a bad thing to do on a Sunday. Samuel is sleeping in the temple near the ark, while Eli is sleeping in his own room, presumably somewhere nearby. And the story begins when Samuel hears a voice calling out to him, "Samuel, Samuel." There is something about being called by name. Now, we know, of course, that it's the voice of God. The narrator is kind enough to let us know. But Samuel has to figure it out for himself. Perhaps we know the feeling. And the first assumption was not that God was calling out to him. It was what any of us would likely assume. He thought it would be the only other person hanging around. And so, in sort of a moment reminiscent of a British comedy sketch, he gets up and walks into Eli, whom we imagine as sort of a lovable curmudgeon a la The Odd Couple, and he goes in and he says, "Here I am, for you called me." And woken up, Eli grumbles and tells Samuel to go back to bed. "I didn't call you," right? Sends him back. At which point Samuel lies down again and again hears that voice, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel jumps up and he goes back into the other room and again awakens Eli. "Here I am, you called me." And Eli sends him back to bed. Now, some of us have been in Samuel's shoes before. Maybe some of us are in them now. Not necessarily literally hearing the voice of God, though, as Miss Paula pointed out, that would be very convenient. But certainly feeling that call in our lives, maybe a nudge, maybe somebody's feeling that nudge, that understanding that maybe it's time to shift something in their lives. Maybe it's time to let go of one thing and pick up another. Maybe God is calling you to something else. Samuel perhaps offers us an example of what we might do in that moment, that is to go to someone we trust. Who are those people in your life? Who is someone that you trust enough to be able to share what's really going on in your life and to listen for the truth? Not who's just going to tell you what you want to hear, but someone who loves you enough to speak the truth to you. Who are those people in your life, and are you willing to listen? The good news is, even if you don't have one of those persons in your life, that is what a church is for. At its best, we're here to listen to one another, to keep pointing one another in the direction of life, to hear how God might be calling each of us toward something else. But it means not just talking about things that everyone already agrees with. It means having some hard conversations, as we've experienced over the last few weeks, over the last few months, over the last few years. Sure, it would be easier if we didn't have to do that. I could stand up every week and preach cotton candy, and we'd have something sweet to chew on. The institution might survive, but the church would wither and die. Friends, we have to be able to talk about hard things, to listen to one another throughout. And there's a responsibility on both sides. Those who are speaking, but those also who listen. See, Eli was tired, and he could have just let it go. He did twice. He tried to just shoo Samuel away, to just go back to bed, to not have to think about it. He could have easily dismissed Samuel because, of course, he was young, and who wants to listen to a young person because he was too green, and who wants to listen to someone who is new? But at some point, some deep level, maybe God was nudging Eli too, because in the moment when he finally heard what Samuel was saying, it was Eli who understood. And passing that knowledge down from one generation to another, Eli told him, "Here's what you do. The next time you hear that voice, go back and just say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." He helped Samuel hear the voice of God in his life. Friends, maybe we can do that for each other. Look, this has been a hard few weeks, after a hard few months, after a hard few years. We could just start telling each other what we want to hear. We could just keep listening to those people who already tell us what we believe. But if we want something better, and as a people of faith, we do, then we're going to have to start being honest with each other. We're going to have to start being open with each other. We're going to have to start being truthful with each other. Friends, the gospel of Jesus Christ is fundamentally about the truth. It's about the promise that it is the truth and only the truth that will set us free. It's about finding those voices in our world that are not yet being heard and lifting them up. It's about speaking truth to power and trusting that once the truth is out there, it will resonate throughout history, throughout time, beyond our own lives. We've recognized that this weekend, don't we? Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was compelled by the gospel of Jesus Christ to speak the truth to the world. He heard a call, and however imperfectly, he answered it. He tested it in community. He reached out to those other people with whom he was in conversation to make sure it was right, and then spoke it to the world. He recognized that until we find a way to talk with one another, we will continue to find ourselves apart. He said, the reason we fail to get along is because we fear each other. And we fear each other because we don't know each other. And we don't know each other because we don't communicate with each other. Friends, if we want to change the world, we have to change the way we live within it. We have to change what we speak into this world. No, we can't control the other voices that are out there, in here, out there, or around. But we can make sure that our voice is not a part of the problem. Yes, just like in the days of Samuel and Eli, we can look around our world right now and say the word of the Lord is rare. Visions are not widespread, but maybe that's not because God isn't speaking. Maybe it's because we are not listening. Maybe, friends, this is our moment to change our posture to this world, to start listening for the true voices in this world and embrace them, to not be afraid to run with them, to embrace them, and to speak them to one another. So how do we do that? How do we find a way to give certain voices power and let go of those that are not life-giving? The only way we've ever been able to. Together. We're going to have to figure it out together because, friends, God is in that space between you and me. God is the truth between us. So let us all turn and face the truth, saying to one another, "Speak, Lord, for your servants are listening." May it be so. Amen.